So my presentation is going to be talking about preparing for the armed intruder. How many have seen the run, hide, fight video or are familiar with the run, hide, fight concept? I'm looking at, it's probably 95% of the people in here. I'm not going to talk about that in a lot of detail. What I'm really going to talk about is for you to go back to your house of worship and look at it from the perspective of what can you do to your facility, what can you do to your policies and plans to better prepare you for an armed intruder attack. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. I've done over 150 facility vulnerability assessments, and believe me, I've picked up on a lot. Every time I go and do an assessment, I learn just a little bit something different, and as a result, I wanted to share those observations with you. So here's a sobering fact, and I'm not telling you anything new, but if somebody walks into a house of worship, kind of something like this type of venue, with a weapon and the intent to use it, so he has the capability and the intent to use it, guess what? People will die, people will be injured. That's just a fact that we have to basically come to grips with. So where do we start? Where can you actually, what can you do? You know, a venue like this, for example, it's going to be awfully difficult to do anything about it. So what I'd like to concentrate on is some proactive measures. What can we do to proactively, hopefully prevent it from ever occurring, but at least mitigate the loss of life and property? So again, we all recognize we do have a moral and a legal obligation to take whatever reasonable measures we can put into place to try and protect lives. And again, this is going to be focusing mostly on the proactive aspects to it. So implement access control measures. And this is really, how many of you here have a school that's associated with your house of worship? Yeah, so roughly 30% or so. How about not really a school so much, but maybe a Sunday class while services is being done? Yeah, quite a few more. So again, it's typically the kids are in a classroom, you have a teacher. We have to look at it from that perspective. That is essentially a school. For all intents and purposes, you have the same concerns and the same vulnerabilities or threats that you have to address as well. But you want to limit the entry points, separate staff entrances from the public entrance if at all possible. And that's really also going to be looking at it from the perspective of everyday life in your house of worship, not necessarily a service, although it applies to that as well. Observe all that enter. I think Ted and Rick did an excellent job of looking into observation technique training. Maybe impart some of those takeaways to your ushers, to your volunteer staff. Do you have, some of you have maybe parking lot attendants that may also be out in the parking lot helping people coming into the churches. They're also another set of eyes and ears. As they also mentioned, solicit some of your parishioners. I like to talk about the Walmart greeter. Why do you suppose Walmart has a greeter? Is it because they just have too much money and want to have another position? Actually, if somebody has a nefarious purpose in mind and they walk into a facility and the first thing they run up against is somebody introducing themselves, asking for any assistance, seeing them face to face, eye to eye, guess what? Are they more likely to walk away from doing any nefarious purposes there or continue with their plan? And more often than not, they're going to walk away and go somewhere else. So that's really the whole psychology behind it. Engage in a conversation with that person, and you'll find that if they have any nefarious purposes, hopefully that'll be taken away. Don't buzz people in and hope that they come to the receptionist desk. I see that a lot where somebody is coming into your facility, and God bless them, they have the doors locked, so they have to check in with the receptionist. The receptionist asks what the nature of their visit is, and she buzzes them in. expecting them to come in and sign in and get a visitor badge or what have you. But guess what? They bypass the receptionist. Now they have free reign to the entire facility. So obviously, you have to strike a balance. The last thing we want to do is convert your house of worship into a military base, but there is a balance, and taking some reasonable measures will hopefully be the solution. So identify band personnel. I think Ted addressed this earlier, but there are people that for whatever reason you want to put on some sort of a list that is a red flag for your receptionists, for your ushers, for whomever takes on a leadership role at your house of worship. And examples include protection from abuse orders that are filed maybe by staff members or volunteers, maybe a woman who is a volunteer at your house of worship comes and tells the pastor or your security personnel, hey, I put a PFA against my ex-husband or my boyfriend, and I just want you to know. Well, that helps, because now if this person wants to come in because he knows where she works, he knows the car she drives, what time she starts her job, and guess what? She's an easy target. So banned individuals might be something you might want to think about putting into place. That also includes former hostile individuals who, for whatever reason, maybe you filed a defiant trespass against them, maybe they were a little belligerent in one of your services, you asked them to leave, maybe you called law enforcement in on them. You want to identify these people because they may come in 6 months or a year later. How many times have we heard that on the news where somebody comes in almost a year and a half later and decides to kind of play out and levelize the playing field, make you pay for what you did to them. They've been harboring this injustice for 6 months or a year, planning and planning and planning, and now you come in, and guess what? The receptionist wasn't even here when you were terminated or when there was this hostile act, and she doesn't recognize you. So maybe on the receptionist PC, maybe there's a hot link. If you can include photos, that'd be great. If not, at least identify what who the person is, so that they can get a proactive way of identifying that, hey, this person shouldn't be in here. What's his nature for the visit? Is he meaning to do some harm? Does the receptionist have a panic alarm that she can contact maybe a security monitoring company or maybe someone else to come in and provide some assistance? So again, these are the kinds of proactive measures that you might want to consider. Terminating an employee or a volunteer, that can be awfully contentious, especially if the person feels like his termination of employment is unjust. That I've given you 2 or 3 or 4 years and done nothing but help you out, and now you're terminating me. Well, it may be because you were caught stealing or whatever the reason is, but they feel like it's an injustice, and they want to come back and kind of levelize the playing field, if you will. So if you can put a webcam in the entrance, the main entrance of your foyer, that'd be a good way to kind of capture a photo of the individual, especially if there's a webcam with an intercom where that person has to talk to the receptionist. Now you've captured them on a photo, you've got a digital photo, you can include that as a hot link on your PCs. Now imagine this person comes in to your daycare or to your Sunday school or whatever and says, I'm here to pick up my nephew Giangi. And this teacher at the reception desk sees this photo, and she immediately sees it's a red flag, and she can take some proactive measures. So keep a pulse on the organization. Keep your finger on the pulse so that if everybody else in your organization knows that 1 or 2 individuals is experiencing a certain hardship or maybe has a substance abuse issue or marital problems or custodial problems with their children because they're going through a contentious divorce, stay on top of those kinds of things. It may not require you to do anything more but monitor it a little bit closer. Then that's really all these things are supposed to do for you is don't take any immediate actions. It may not necessitate terminating someone or parting your relationship with the individual, but at least if you're on top of what's going on in your organization, you can provide that additional scrutiny And maybe, God forbid, if something does happen, at least you're not caught by surprise. You've known about it. You ask your security team to just pay a little bit closer attention to that one or two individuals, and that'll be one step ahead of the game. People experience substance abuse. Maybe if you have a program where you're Alcohol Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or whatever you happen to have, well, guess what? I mean, there's more of a likelihood for hostilities to come out of those kinds of venues than other venues. Soup kitchens, obviously, is another issue that, and if you all have something like that, I think you've all experienced, some little scuffles or what have you that may arise as a result of that venue. I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, I'm sure. Obviously, if you have inmates coming in, and there's a reason for that. Obviously, you're trying to help them reintegrate back into society. Former inmates, that's going to be another potential act for violence. Maybe they come in with a weapon, or maybe they start acting out. So those are the kinds of measures, anticipating them well in advance and taking the necessary steps to train your staff as to how to deal with these kinds of issues, how to diffuse these kinds of situations so they don't become violent. So monitor what people are saying about your house of worship. I don't know if you all are into, Twitter and Facebook and all kinds of social media, but they're a necessary evil. Whether you like it or not, they're here. And people are listening to them, people are engaging in it. So there may be postings about your pastor. Maybe there's a posting about your church or your house of worship. Maybe they disagree with the fact that the Catholic Church don't allow females to become priests, or why can't they be more accepting of same-sex marriages, or whatever the contentious issue happens to be. They end up taking it out on this one particular church just to get their 15 minutes of fame. So those kinds of postings could be a real strong red flag if something is being posted about, and I have no idea why. Some people will be freely posting something for millions of people to read, but they will never say anything face-to-face to anybody. But thankfully they do, and we could take advantage of that as another means of intelligence so that we can stay one step ahead and be aware of what's going on. Local chatter. If you have a cafe or you have a festival or what have you, and all of a sudden people are talking about using their guns and not liking certain people and wanting to act out, and those are what we call clues. Those are what we call indicators, and maybe all you need to do is just bring it up, raise it up to the red flag, and let people in the leadership positions know about it, and let them take whatever course of action is necessary. And finally, if you don't have something like this, some anonymous suggestion box or some way for people to alert you to a safety or security issue without any fear of retribution. That's a way for them to kind of let you know, hey, I've overheard John Smith talking about having a real concern with a certain person. I don't think there's anything to it, but just in case, I want someone to know about it. Maybe they don't want that to be given out, face to face because of that they're embarrassed, or they fear that John might hear about it and come back after them or their children. So allow that kind of an opportunity for people to kind of vent and let you know about issues that are on their minds. And again, all you need to do maybe is just closely monitor. And maybe the person that they're talking about maybe is taking a leadership role in your church. Maybe they're collecting the offerings or what have you. And now if you're suspicious that maybe they have a substance abuse issue, is that really the person that you want to be collecting the baskets and dealing with cash counting and handling and depositing and that sort of thing? So stay one step ahead of the process. And that's really the major continuous takeaway that I'm going to be harping on. So train staff and volunteers to be observant. I thought Ted and Rick's presentation was outstanding. Oftentimes I see in my own church, when I go to services, the ushers who help people to their seats are more interested in talking about the grandchildren and the fish they caught this last weekend, as opposed to really looking for things that are just a little bit abnormal, a little bit outside the norm, to give them pause for cause and that sort of thing. So you need to kind of impart to them that it is, they're empowered to look for these kinds of unusual indicators, if you will. And I know sometimes it's against our human nature. You know, we don't want to feel like we're spying or snitching or anything like that. But really, that's really part of the job, as I see it, is to stay on top of what's going on at your house of worship. Managing aggressive behavior. Again, there's formalized courses for this, workplace violence awareness and how to deal with it. Law enforcement officers here know exactly what I'm talking about. Their demeanor, the way they approach an incident, really is going to dictate in large part how it may end. If they come in a calm manner and try and kind of put everybody at ease and talk normally in a civil fashion and that sort of thing, things tend to de-escalate, as opposed to them coming in like a bull in a china closet and you know, it may just escalate one party against the other party. How many of you have been in a situation where the person says he's trying to get information, he's trying to let you know he's just pissed off at the world, basically, for lack of a better phrase, and he thinks that you just don't get it. So what he says is, I want to talk to your supervisor. What do you think that means when he says, I want to talk to your supervisor? Basically, what it means is he's not getting through to you. You're not connecting. So I want to talk to anybody else but you. And in some cases, that may not be a bad thing to do. If this person is channeling and focusing their hostility towards you because you're not connecting with them, maybe the best thing to do is to get out of harm's way, bring somebody else in, hopefully with another person, so there's two people there, and let them kind of calm the situation. Well, okay, I can understand you and John may not have seen eye to eye. Can you tell me exactly what's on your mind? Can we maybe walk outside of the church and maybe talk so that we don't disrupt other people worshiping? And that kind of de-escalates. That's a disarming way of kind of putting back things into a more civilized conversation. Know when to call law enforcement. Know when it's hey, this is really more than I'm trained to do, and I'm not going to be the one. I don't want to be John Wayne. So you have to know when to step back and say, you know what, I don't think this is going the way I intended. I don't feel comfortable about this. Let me have somebody call 911 and let them deal with it. Know how to interface with law enforcement when law enforcement arrives. And that's absolutely important, especially when we get into responding to active shooters. And finally, rules of engagement. At what point do you or your staff or your volunteers know, hey, don't use any physical force. This is the line that you won't cross, and let them know that that's the situation. Have you seen a TV commercial lately where there's a monitor in the bank, and there's a holdup at the bank, and the guy says, hey, aren't you going to do anything? Oh, I'm just a monitor. I'm not here to do anything. And guess what? You have a holdup. Just to let you know, I'm doing my job. So just so you know the rules of engagement, make that very clear. Hey, at this point, if it crosses this line, you know, you step back and you call in law enforcement. You call in somebody else that can take care of the situation. A threat assessment team. And ideally, if you have a threat assessment, how many have a threat assessment team for your organization or your congregation? Yeah, I don't see much of that at all. But what this does is it's a multidisciplined team of folks that maybe have some security training, maybe some medical training. They can evaluate the credibility of a threat. Is this threat worthy of my taking action? What can I do? What should I do when I see this threat? And there's formal guidance that walks them through the process. And it also allows you to come back and say, we've dealt with this fairly. We didn't discriminate against this person. We do this for any time we receive a threat. So it kind of helps the organization out that way as well. But in essence, it evaluates the known threats that may surface throughout your year. Formal guidance is available. For example, a bomb threat is phoned in, and it says, the guy that's on the phone says, hey, I've got a bomb that's going to go off at your festival this Sunday. Okay, now you receive this threat. You step back and you say, all right, do we cancel the festival? Do we bring in law enforcement? Is this just some wingnut that's just trying to disrupt the whole process? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? So again, that's a pretty important decision to have to make. And so you kind of want to make sure that the process is in place so that it guides you to making the right decision. And at the end of the day, you have to make the decision that you think is appropriate, and we live by it. Panic alarms. How many have panic alarms? Distress alarm signals. That's about maybe 20%. That's another good tool to have. They have wireless panic alarms now, so you don't have to go through the labor and the cost of running wires throughout an existing building. But where would you think the panic alarms should be? Obviously for a house of worship, anywhere that you handle cash, counting cash, depositing storage of cash, those valuables. I know some of your houses of worship, you may have some pretty expensive metal, brass, gold, that sort of thing. Musical instruments, sound systems, extremely expensive. So those are the areas which you might want to look at providing some additional protection for. But your daycare, your school centers. So if someone is going out to a certain area and they're a little concerned because maybe they have a money bag with them or whatever, give them an ability to help notify people of a potential hostile act. It may go to your security monitoring company directly. It may go to your law enforcement officers, your police stations. Again, workplace violence awareness, training your staff and volunteers, diffusing techniques, and early warning indicators. Bomb threat response. I oftentimes ask, do you have a checklist? And invariably, the hands go up. But then I ask, can you pull that out for me? Imagine you just got a phone call while we're talking right now. You just get a phone call, and the guy says, I have a bomb in your facility. And usually what happens is the receptionist or the secretary has to go to a filing cabinet, pull out the drawer, hope that she finds the folder, pulls the folder out, and then guess what? You're probably not going to have the luxury of doing that if you have a bomb threat that's called in on a phone. So you want to make sure it's immediately available to you. I recommend a hot link on your PC where every time it's part of your startup folder, every time you start up your PC, there's a hot link at the bottom. Maybe you have an icon of a bomb or whatever, so it's very easy to open up. Or maybe part of your phone books or right where your telephone is located. And it walks you through what you want to ask the individual. Oftentimes, fortunately, bomb threats are just meant to disrupt a schedule. Maybe they want to get out of something. Maybe they just want to just make life miserable for you without really intending to harm or kill anybody. So to that end, if you can ask where the bomb is, what time is it going to go off, why are you picking on our organization, what do we do type of thing, all that information is useful from a post-incident investigational aspect. Does the person have an accent? Do you recognize the voice? That sort of thing is all pretty critical. So logical first steps. Assemble a house of worship emergency response team. Develop emergency response plans and checklists. Jim Craddy introduced us to a phone app. That's one way to start, but you can start in a number of areas. Procure needed emergency equipment and train and exercise personnel on all of the above. That is absolutely critical. Maybe when you bring on a volunteer or a staff member for the first time, you start right off with an orientation process. And maybe once a year you revisit. Let's all get together. Hey, just as a refresher, here's the emergency response checklist. Here's where the AEDs are located. Here's where the first aid kits are located. And let's walk through a scenario just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same sheet of music. That really speaks volumes, I think, for your congregation and to your staff members, that you're really taking their security and safety seriously. So this is a sample of an emergency response team that you might want to think about for all your services, your house of worship services. I know you do this, for example, with ushers or maybe a greeter, but do you go to the next step and say, whoever is going to show up for the 10:30 Mass, for example, is there a medical person that I know who they are, where they're sitting? Is there somebody that knows the mechanical aspects of the church or the facility that I can tap and get that information from? And maybe you go through this for every service and you say, hey, when you come in, if you're not on an assigned schedule, maybe when you do come into a 10:30 service, you introduce yourself to the head usher. You know, Tim will be over here at the side. Introduce yourself to him. Let him know, hey, I'm a doctor. I'll be sitting in the front right side of the church. Just that's a great way for people to kind of let you know about situational awareness and where I can find somebody if, God forbid, something happens to somebody in the congregation. So again, think about that. It's an easy thing to. Obviously, the larger your congregation, the easier it is. But even the smaller groups, you probably know most of each other, and you know what their training and experience is behind them. So potential emergency response members, where do you start? Start with your congregation. If your cleric gets up at the podium at one of the services and says, hey, we're in need. We went to this workshop on a Saturday in Hershey, and somebody suggested that we look at it from X, Y, and Z. So is there anybody here that either is currently or formerly military or law enforcement or has medical training? If so, and you'd like to volunteer your services, please see us after the service. We'd like to see what we can do to help each other out. And you'd be amazed that I think you're going to get a lot of people who just need to be asked, what can I do to help out? And this is a great starting point. But you've got firefighters, you've got EMTs. I'm sure that are all part of your congregation. All they need to know is that hey, you're asking for assistance. I'd be happy to help. Sure. So again, those are potential resources. Emergency response checklist. I was passing around, everybody get a chance to kind of glean through the checklist. And again, it's not all inclusive. Yours may be a little bit different given your demographics, your location, and so on. But you get the idea. You get the gist of what the checklists are all about. In fact, if anybody's interested in it, I can give you the name of the group that puts some of these booklets out. They're at somewhere in the New England area. But they're usually about $50, $60 for each booklet. Or you can do it yourself if you'd like. But they're real easy. They scatter throughout the area, and you'd be able to easily get your hands on it and walk through bullet by bullet checklist and get your actions done. I like the KISS principle. You don't want to get overwhelming with a lot of information. Just highlight the salient points, and that'll help people walk through. So, for example, an active shooter, the receptionist, whoever's doing the announcement, there should be a checklist for that receptionist with the public address system that says, here's the message that I put out. There's an active shooter in the building. White male, Caucasian, last seen in the cafeteria area with a rifle, wearing camouflage. What does that tell people? Now it provides them with the information that there's an active shooter in a building, but guess what? It identifies what he looks like, what he's carrying, what he's wearing, where he was last seen, so now they can make a much more intelligent decision when you really have to look at run, hide, or fight, as opposed to just active shooter, and now you don't know if you go out this exit, that may be where he was last seen, or that may be where shots were last fired. Not a smart thing to do, but you don't know unless the announcement provides you with that level of specificity. Sample emergency equipment. I like to encourage organizations to have go kits or emergency kits near the exits. And it's anybody's imagination as to what you stockpile in a kit. But you get the idea here. I like to also, if you use walkie-talkies or handheld radios, maybe have one or two dedicated, set aside for use by law enforcement should they arrive for an incident. That way you're all communicating on the same system. First aid kits, where are they located? Does everybody know where your first aid kits or your AED kits are at your house of worship? How quickly can you get your hands on it? Has anybody had formal training either in first aid or on the use of AEDs? That's very important. How about fire extinguisher training? If you've never had to use a fire extinguisher, it sounds like it's pretty easy to do, but there are some certain techniques that you want to make sure you're employing when you do use the fire extinguisher. And you don't want that to be the first time where you're really up against a major fire. Hemorrhage control kits. I've been pushing this, unfortunately, because of the nature of what we hear about today. But hemorrhage control kits are fairly inexpensive, and they can do a world of good to saving lives in those precious few minutes. And the Stop the Bleed program, I think, will really drive that home for all of us. Again, flashlights, batteries. You can never have too much duct tape. Designated area custodians. Now, this really depends on the complexity of your house of worship. But what I like to do is when I come into a facility like this, imagine this is a typical sanctuary or worship area, and I have, let's say, maybe 5 or 6 ushers. What I'd like to have them do is to say, Usher A, Tim, you've got this quadrant right here. And Don, you've got this middle section here. And you know, Carol, you've got this section over here. And what does that mean? That essentially says when things go south, when for whatever reason there's a fire or evacuation or whatever, Tim's the guy that's responsible for making sure all of his people in his area are going out the right exit. Imagine if we just say, hey, there's a fire, everybody evacuate, and you all decide to all go out that one door, as opposed to other doors that may be preventing the bottlenecking like we saw in the restroom area over the break today. So the people who are assigned that section stay in that section, and they know I've got Mary who's in a wheelchair, I've got this one guy who's going through you know, maybe muscular dystrophy or what have you. I know my area, and I know if things go south, that here's what I'm going to end up doing. In fact, what I sometimes find, and I don't have it here, maybe it's on another slide, but you have a reserved section, a reserved seating for the mobility impaired or the people with special needs. Sometimes I see that section being in the middle of your house of worship as opposed to closer to your exit. So you really want to go about it, think about it a little differently. When you walk into your house of worship, make sure your reserved section for the mobility impaired is closest to the exit, because the last thing you want to do is to help somebody with special needs who's in the middle of the house of worship and try and get them through this melee of people evacuating. So think about it from that perspective as well. It allows you to better focus on a much smaller area. I can handle this little section. I can't possibly handle this entire sanctuary. And you want to make sure that everybody in your section knows who you are and that you're going to kind of help them get through this disaster or this incident that happens to be plaguing you. So obviously this is a typical configuration, and you can see how the seating is all segmented. Maybe you can assign the area custodians to that way, whether it's north, south, east, west, or you take this section, I'll take this section, and it's much easier and allows for a more organized fashion of responding to an emergency. The layered security concept. And this is where you really start looking at it from the perspective of, I can have a security person, so that's 2 eyes, or I can have a multiplier, a force multiplier, and maybe that's engaging some of your parishioners, like Rick Gilbert mentioned earlier, engaging some of your parking lot attendants, your greeters. How about your choir? Depending on where the choir is, if they're either in the orchestra or up front, they all have a different vantage point. They all have a different perspective and a field of vision. The pastor or your lead cleric has another advantage as well. He's the one that's seeing everything coming in at him, where you guys are facing me, so you may not see what's coming in from the back door, where he does. So if you engage all of them and empower all of them to be part of the process, you'll get a lot more in terms of intelligence and early warning indicators. So a major deterrent to active shooters, the presence of law enforcement. The presence of law enforcement, a uniformed law enforcement officer, even a cruiser, a squad car or whatever parked right out front is a major deterrent. The Pulse nightclub shooter in Orlando, I don't know if you've all heard recently that apparently he was first targeting Disney. What made him change his mind about Disney? Security. They were heavily fortified with security. It was no easy task. He went there, looked around, and said, nah, you know, I don't think I'm going to have much a way out here, so let me go somewhere else. And that's how they choose their targets, unfortunately. The presence of a law enforcement vehicle, the presence of a security officer, even if it's not law enforcement, at least it's security. So to the extent that you can show that there's a show of force, it's going to be a deterrent. It's going to be a deterrent. I encourage facilities, houses of worship, to reach out to their police department and ask them to come in to their parking lot and fill out their paperwork. Ask them to come in, don't laugh about this, but have some coffee and donuts inside your house of worship, and that'll be a major deterrent in and of itself. So reach out to them, and more than likely they're willing to help out. I mean, they have to fill out their paperwork somewhere. Why not come to your house of worship to do it? I'm going to get a lot of ribbing at that, I'm sure I am. You don't mess with people with weapons in their holsters. Consider locking all. Now this is an option. You don't have to do this. But what I recommend sometimes is a house of worship. Let's say you have a 10:30 Mass. Service is at 10:30. Maybe at 10:20 or 10:25, you lock the front doors and you put a sign that says, if you're running late, please come in through the main entrance to minimize disruption to worshipers. Okay, what that does then is it allows the ushers or the security personnel to focus their attention on 2 or 3 doors instead of 5 or 6 doors. And again, if they come in through the front way right by the altar, it is more of a distraction to worshipers. So I think they would accept that. They would understand that's the reasoning. If you're running late, just as a courtesy, just go around. I know it's going to mean a little bit of a longer walk, but that's another option to consider. And of course, everybody inside the house of worship should be able to egress, so we don't violate any fire and panic codes, but somebody coming from the outside will not be able to come in because the door is locked. So training and exercises. If you've not done this, you know, it's a crawl, walk, run process. I'm not saying that in the middle of a service, you throw the congregation into a tizzy and say, we're going to have an exercise. Maybe you don't want to start at that level, but maybe what you want to do is your emergency response team member, and you bring in law enforcement, and you bring in anybody else who's likely firefighters, and you say, hey, we're running a tabletop exercise. We just want to make sure, we just put together an emergency plan. We want to make sure that the stakeholders have buy-in, that they're familiar with our process, and maybe offer some advice or suggestions for improving the process. And you walk through a scenario. What if this happens? How would we respond? What if this happens? And then you're going to find out that law enforcement might come back and say, hey, contrary to popular opinion, we may not be here in 2 minutes like your emergency plan thinks that we will be. Well, how long will it take? And then they find out that, well, if you're going to tell us to come in, is there a Knox box where we can come in 2 o'clock in the morning and get in your facility in response to a fire alarm? No, we don't have. What is a Knox box? And again, you engage that conversation and you start to learn about your expectations, your capabilities. Extremely important to share that information. And that's when you talk about the armed intruder plan. You can get into some level of sophistication. You give them a tour of your facility. What I really push for is an emergency responder booklet. You can do that in hard copy or digital media. It really depends on the nature of your emergency responders. But in this booklet, you tell them where all the exits are. You tell them where all the utility shutoffs are located. You tell them where chemicals maybe are stored. And that's worth its weight in gold if they have to respond in a real emergency. They're not seeing and hearing and learning about this for the very first time. They've had the benefit of going through an exercise with you. They walk through the facility. They're going to feel a lot more comfortable responding to an emergency at your facility, having had that experience. So again, invites off-site emergency responders, evaluate the lessons learned, and more importantly, make changes. So if you learn something from the firefighters or from the law enforcement officers or from your volunteers and staff members, go back in and tweak your emergency plan, tweak your checklist, make it a little bit better as a result of that process. The last thing you want to do is go through the exercise program or God forbid, a real incident, and you learn some lessons and you never incorporate some of those lessons into the process. It goes basically forgotten. So how to respond? Everybody knows about the run, hide, fight. There are 3 ways basically. Running away from danger if you can. If there's an armed intruder, an announcement, you run. You either, if you can't do that practically, will hide, and as a very last resort, will fight. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this as well. So to run or not to run, that really is the question. Deciding whether to run and where to run is so important in your decision-making process. There has to be a notification system. If you don't have a public address system to notify everybody that there's a danger in the facility, and by everybody I mean the teachers in the classrooms, maybe in the basement level, maybe somebody is in another building, but they're part of the house of worship. Everybody should be able to hear an announcement that says, there's an active shooter, don't use codes. Law enforcement discourages the use of codes. If you're not familiar with the code, you don't know what's going on. So plain English language is what law enforcement encourages, and it makes a lot of sense. Specify as much detail as possible. Like I mentioned, armed intruder, last seen in the east side of the building, wearing XYZ, carrying a rifle, wearing camouflage, that sort of. Provide as much detail as possible. And if you can, sometimes if you don't have a public address system, you have to think outside the box. Maybe you come back and say, how about our phone system? Let's get together with the IT people. Can they program the phone system so if I hit *1, it becomes basically a public address system. So every room that has a phone at least will hear what I'm announcing. So kind of think about what needs to be done. Sometimes there's wireless public address systems, so you don't have to incur the cost of running wires through an existing building. But if you talk to the right people, you'll be amazed at what options you're going to have available to you. But you have to ask those questions. Ease and accessibility of making the notification. I once went to a facility and I said, do you have a public address system? Yes, we do. So instead of just checking it off like, okay, good for them, I asked the next question, can you demonstrate it for me? And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. And well, I haven't used it in quite a while. It's down the hall and it's in the room that's locked and I have to get a key to get, I'm like, okay, well that's not doing you a lot of good. So you want to make sure that A, it's tested periodically, it's easily accessible, and people know they're proficient on its use. Ideally, if you can access that public address system from multiple locations, that's a real best practice. That's a real thumbs up. But again, let's crawl, walk, and run, and we'll eventually get to where we want to go. Leave belongings behind. Okay, first things first, your life is the most important aspect. Run away from shots fired and towards law enforcement. So if shots are fired from that section, obviously you want to come out this way. If law enforcement is coming in through that direction, you want to go towards the law enforcement area. That pathway is the safest route. Warn others along the way. Again, location of reserved mobility impaired. We talked about that in terms of where they would need assistance. Show hands to arriving law enforcement officers. Law enforcement officers are trained, hands kill. Okay? They don't know you from Adam. They don't know you from the perpetrator. Who knows? You might, to them, appear like maybe you're the shooter. And if for whatever reason, we're going to get into this a little bit further, so I don't want to steal any of the thunder, but let's say a member of the congregation has a concealed carry permit and they pull out a gun. How does a law enforcement officer know that you're not the shooter? So there's a lot of things that come into play here. They're going to be nervous. Their adrenaline pump is going to be in high speed. So, you need to let them know that hey, you don't mean any harm. You're going to comply with their orders. Here are my hands to let you know I don't have a weapon. And basically, ladies, now would not be a good time to go up and hug that law enforcement officer, because that's just not an appropriate thing to do at that time. So the law enforcement will be on heightened alert. Take that into consideration. If you decide to run and you're being shot at, try to run in a zigzag manner. I mean, it's just common sense. I'm not telling you anything that isn't really not common sense. Don't tend to the wounded unless you feel it is absolutely safe to do so. In the grand scheme of things, you'll end up being a victim as well as they are. And let's let law enforcement, EMTs, as Gary Ligori mentioned earlier, they are evolving to the point where they're going to provide quicker care and immediate care, urgent care as needed, as opposed to years ago when we just waited until the person was either arrested or neutralized before they went in to save them. And then, of course, call 911 when time and safety permits. Hiding out. There's a lot that goes with this slide, but where you hide out is obviously critically important. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and to conceal any glass on either doors or walls in that room that you're hiding out in. Locking the doors, I find this to be the case more often than not, especially classrooms, unfortunately. You can't not lock the door from the inside of the room. You have to physically go out in the hallway. Now imagine if there's an active shooter announcement. The last thing anybody wants to do is to go out in the hallway and subject themselves to possibly getting shot. So you have to think about it today rather than tomorrow in terms of what can we do, given that this is the circumstances that we're dealt. I can't lock this door because of the way the lock is set up. Well, A, you can change the locks so you can't lock it from the inside, or you can go through some other means of locking it. One of the things that we also suggest is prior to any classes starting, the teacher goes out in the hallway, puts the key in the lock, locks it, and then prevents the door from hitting the strike plate. And you can do that. I think I have. Okay, so here's an example of a door lock that cannot be locked from inside the room. And you can see it has no key slot at all in it. But you have to go on the other side, and there is a key slot. So these little magnets, or any refrigerator magnet, $3.99 for a 10-pack. Go to Staples, go to Walmart, you find a whole bunch of refrigerator magnets. So you lock the door of that classroom before class starts, and then you come back in, and the little Johnny wants to go to the bathroom or whatever, he can go in and out as he pleases, because you put this magnet on the sides there, and it prevents the door from hitting the strike plate, so it does not lock. Now you hear an active shooter announcement, or you hear gunshots fired. from inside the room, all you have to do is go in and pull that magnet out and shut that door, and it's locked. So it's another way of thinking proactively. You can do that without changing the locks, which may cost you $50 or $100. It's an easy way to kind of get around that limitation. This is something else that you might, if you talk to your law enforcement officers, your police, your local police department, and you say, listen, here's our armed intruder plan. We can get as sophisticated as, for example, if we post this sign on a piece of paper on the window after we call 911, you'll know what that means. It's room 331, there's 25 people, and there's 2 injured. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now that gives them a little bit more intelligence in terms of what they should do when they respond. Again, this is maybe getting into a little bit more detail, but it's only as good as you and the police department agree that this is something that you want to do in your local community. It may not be good for Susquehanna Township, but maybe it works for Manheim Township because you all have gotten an agreement on what to do. Here's another, inside the room, the facilities itself, oftentimes the signs of where the rooms are located right on the wall itself. Now, if you're law enforcement and you're looking for room 331, because 911 dispatcher says there's 25 people hiding and 2 injured in room 331, you'll be able to see where room 331 is from either side of that sign from a safe distance, as opposed to having to come right to that door before you find out where room 331 is. Again, it's a human factor thing, but if you're going to change signs for the rooms, this might be something to consider. So having glass on all, or where the glass is on doors and windows, have the capability of concealing that glass. Now during normal school days, you want to keep that open. You want to have that open so that from a children's protection standpoint, but if there's an active shooter announcement, be able to put that piece of paper or blind or shade or whatever and conceal who's hiding in that room. Some organizations put maybe Velcro stickers on the 4 corners of the glass, and all they need to do is just grab a piece of fabric or whatever and stick it onto the Velcro, and it immediately conceals that there's people hiding out in that room. Can room lights be easily turned off? In this day and age where we're trying to conserve on electricity, maybe they're on timers or maybe they're on motion sensors. If you're hiding out in a room and all of a sudden somebody moves and the lights go on, again, that's going to give away the fact that somebody's in that room. So all you're trying to do is buy time. You're trying to buy 2, 3, 5 minutes. Police will arrive and they'll take this guy out or he'll take himself out. But in the interim, you've got that precious time where you want to get yourself distance between him and you. And that's really what comes down to the hiding process. Silence your cell phones and silence any equipment that's likely to make noise that you're in the room. That could be a copier machine, that could be a computer, whatever it might be. Put them on silence mode. If you can, silence your cell phone. If you call 911, you may want to leave it on if you can do it safely. Are room numbers displayed outside the rooms like we talked about on that slide? But how about room numbers displayed inside the room? So I was at a facility just recently, and we're looking at an armed intruder plan, and I said, who would be in this classroom? And they said, oh, you never know. It could be, you know, a volunteer, it could be. So I said, so nobody's really assigned to this room? No, they aren't. So is it safe to assume that they may not know that that room is 301? Yeah, that's probably a safe assumption, but all they have to do is go out in the hallway and they can see it's room 301. But if it's an armed intruder, they're not going to want to do that. So maybe just a sign inside the room right by the door that says room 301. Human factor-wise, you don't really think about those kinds of things until you play out a scenario like an active shooter. So again, think proactively. What can we do to prevent these things from hurting us? Barricade the door as best as you can. Personnel should be spread apart in the room, not hunkered in one area, so it's easier of a target for the shooter. And again, when safe to do so, call 911. Oh, and this is an example of, it's called night lock. We don't make any money on these. I'm just giving you these as examples. But this is a night lock. In fact, we were at Central Penn College, and they had this. So all you do is you lift that up, and it'll tell you that it'll lock the door and prevent it from opening up from the outside. I've seen these examples in houses of worship where the door handles, the doors swing out, and if these are on the outside, if somebody chains them or ties them with a rope, guess what? Everybody in the congregation is trapped and they can't get out. So I asked them to consider changing out the handles. And only as a last resort, fight. So if you're hiding in a room, think about a plan. If this idiot comes into our room, what are we going to do? And we're not trying to turn you into Rambos, but it's fight or be killed. And so it really makes sense to have a plan. Maybe 2 or 3 guys on either side of the door. Maybe you get a fire extinguisher. You've got flags. You've got all kinds of things that could be improvised as weapons. You need to take. Okay, so develop an armed intruder plan, provide the checklist, coordinate with the off-site emergency response community, and run a drill. If you have personnel that are mentally or physically maybe limited, make sure evacuating these people are provided for in your armed intruder plan. In some cases, you want to add additional barriers so that it limits this person's access to that area. If I'm doing a nursing home assessment, for example, a dementia ward, for example, or kindergartners, running may not be practical. So you want to introduce additional barriers in your active shooter plan. And what if the fire alarm activates? Either immediately after an active shooter announcement, or you hear shots are being fired. Your plan needs to address that. I don't profess to have the answer, but whatever answer works for you, you need to make sure your people are trained on it. Because obviously, you know, if the perpetrator is activating the fire alarm in hopes of getting everybody out in the hallway for easy targets, that needs to be worked into your plan as well. So the takeaway here, go back and look at your facility in a different set of eyes. I want you to evaluate your facility. Look at it from the human factor side that we just talked about. What can you do to tweak your facility and your plans and procedures to better facilitate an armed intruder plan? My contact information if you need to reach me, if you're not on my distribution list.